Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, which is Managing LIHEAP Vendor Refunds with the Division of Energy Assistance, Office of Community Services. I am John Thompson. I'm an auditor with the Division of Energy Assistance, and I will be starting off today's webinar. Next slide. So vendor refunds has been a widely requested training and technical assistance subject for LIHEAP. So I'm glad that our office can provide some much needed direction in this area. Let me first begin by stating that LIHEAP funds are a federal block grant, being that they never lose their federal characteristics until the funds are fully expended or liquidated. This is supported by 31 USC 1301A, which states that public funds may be used only for the purpose or purposes for which they were appropriated. The LIHEAP statute section 2506 part B7, which speaks if the state chooses to pay home energy supply vendors directly, they must establish procedures to protect the rights of LIHEAP clients receiving benefits, and also define the duties of the energy supplier in regards to supplying the benefit and payments. It's also important to mention that LIHEAP funds can become deobligated once an account becomes dormant, after the federal obligation period ends, and proper reconciliation must happen within the obligation and liquidation period. This is supported by 45 CFR Code of Federal Regulations 96.30 and USC United States Code 1502. All these citations will be mentioned later in the webinar. Through our monitoring visits and observations, we've seen many ways that refunds have been processed. Some we have seen as acceptable, and other means as requiring additional training and technical assistance. In certain instances, we saw clearly erroneous practices as well. While today's webinar may not answer all of your questions regarding this topic, we assure that the presentation and accompanying materials can assist your office with developing acceptable vendor refund policies and procedures, which will help your state, territorial, or tribal government in the LIHEAP vendor refund process. Today's webinar is meant to be informative and we hope interactive as well. There are two boxes at the bottom of your screen. One of them is a chat box for which you can type in your general comments and communicate when there's poll questions that come up. There is another box that's labeled Q&A. It's our desire that you can type your questions there, and we will be monitoring all questions. If you can't wait to the end of the webinar when we have our Q&A section, that if you can type all your questions there, and we'll address them towards the end of the webinar. So right now, I also want to mention that we do have a guide that we'll be sending out. We have a webinar TNA guide. We will be sending that out within a week of after the presentation today. But we also have a webinar. We also have a attachment for a webinar checklist, the vendor refund checklist that we will be attaching in the chat box today. So with all that mentioned, and we have a lot of information to cover, so I will turn it over to Chetan Mahajan right now of ICF. Chetan?
Thanks, John. And hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Chetan Mahajan. I'm with ICF. And today the presenters from the ICF team will be Dee Shelkey, Blake Worthington, and Jason Clevenger. In recent years, the following four categories have consistently had the greatest number of findings from federal fiscal monitoring of grant recipients: administrative costs, carryover and SF 425 reporting, subrecipient fiscal monitoring, and vendor refunds. OCS has created many technical assistance resources, or TA resources, which support grant recipients in helping to prevent and resolve issues related to these categories. And since these categories have had the highest number of findings which continue to reoccur, OCS has developed TA guides for each of these categories. Today's discussion focuses on the most recent TA guide for vendor refunds. A few final enhancements are being made to the TA guide, and a copy of it will be provided to everyone within the next week or so. Also, last fiscal year, we presented a TA guide for waste, fraud, and abuse prevention, detection, and correction, as well as for subrecipient fiscal monitoring. Both are great resources for you to refer to in parallel with the TA guide for vendor refunds, so that your monitoring efforts adequately help you with overseeing program integrity for LIHEAP. And as we'd mentioned when we presented our first TA guide for admin costs, each TA guide isn't developed as a perfect solution. The intent is to provide information that should be considered for efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds, and break it down as simply as possible into a series of, say, 5 to 10 elements to address. Please provide feedback to us on how helpful the TA guides are with your own efforts for being efficient and compliant, and whether information could be clarified or explained further. For vendor refunds, the TA guide may help you with increasing relevant awareness within your programs and ensuring that you have acceptable processes and procedures in place to determine when a refund is due and how that affects your LIHEAP operations, including reporting. And many different types of entities can be involved in supporting a grant recipient with implementing LIHEAP, typically based on requirements in a subaward or other documented requirements. Throughout this guide, these entities will be referred to as partnering agencies. It's key to note that these partnering agencies could be subgrant recipients, local administering agencies, local offices, weatherization agencies, contractors, other state, tribal, territorial agencies, outreach, and intake agencies. Let's go ahead and start off our discussion on the TA guide for managing vendor refunds.
Thanks, Chetan. Hi, everyone. I'm Didi Shauki. Thank you for joining us today. So let's briefly discuss the process for developing the vendor's refund TA guide. So we examined grant recipients' LIHEAP, HHS LIHEAP monitoring reports, and identified the most common issues related to vendor refunds. Then we studied the issues and found that they mapped to 6 common required actions. Next, we reviewed many of OCS's existing TA resources from the LIHEAP Virtual Library and the LIHEAP Navigator to identify resources that provided technical assistance on how to address these 6 required actions. Now, from this initial review, 24 resources were identified as having the most valuable information related to these required actions. So these resources included information memorandums or IMs, Dear Colleague letters or DCLs, action transmittals or ATs, webinars, and conference and regional meeting presentations. Now, these resources were reviewed in great detail. Then contents from some of these resources plus newly created contents was used to develop a focused 15-page TA guide. So this TA guide serves as one resource that grant recipients can reference to help prevent and address common issues instead of having to search through and review multiple resources. So in today's webinar, we'll first discuss how to use the vendor refunds guide and then take you through the guide and emphasize some key points. And the flow of this webinar will match the order of how information is presented in the guide. And while we won't cover all the material, we will refer you to page numbers so that you can find the relevant information in the guide. So this icon will indicate the starting page of where you can find that relevant information. And the intent of using this webinar in conjunction with the vendor's refund TA guide is to increase your understanding of processing vendor refunds. And the guide focuses on 6 core elements that grant recipients should address to ensure efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds. So now let's discuss how to use the guide. Now, the TA guide is structured to address the range of required actions that can arise for a category, with the required actions listed as elements, then the technical assistance for how to address the corresponding required action is provided. Now, the layout of each guide starts with the table of contents, where you'll find the introduction, common requirements and regulations, followed by the core elements to address for efficient and compliant use of LIHEAP funds. Then the resources section that includes links to the OCS resources that were primarily used to develop the guide. And lastly, the appendices. Well, there's a lot of useful information and example in the appendices. And as we go through the core elements, we'll point out some of those examples from the appendices that relate to that particular element. And in addition to the TA guide, you'll also find a self-assessment checklist that is included at a handout to the webinar that John mentioned a little bit earlier. Note that the left column in the self-assessment follows the guide's table of contents. So as you read the TA guide, reflect on the 6 key elements and document any thoughts. So the checklist could help you keep track of these items. What are you doing well? In those cases, there isn't much need for improvement. Areas that you want to know more about, or areas where there may be an opportunity for improvement. Areas where you could share your success and help other grant recipients, for example, by sharing your written procedures, tools, and template. And lastly, you could document any next steps. And we know a lot of grant recipients are doing a great job in many of these areas, but to continuously improve your programs, consider periodically revisiting this checklist to identify and resolve any opportunities for improvement. And please reach out to OCS if you identified any areas for which you'd like additional TA and for areas for which you'd like to share your success.
Thanks, Dee Dee. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Clevenger. These are the 6 core elements from the guide that we will be discussing regarding vendor refunds. How to document vendor refund procedures, how to communicate vendor refund procedures, how to ensure refunds are adequately tracked, how to determine whether refunds are due, how to determine when refunds can be reissued as benefits and when they must be returned to the federal government, and how to determine when refunds require updates to be made to the carryover and reallotment report, SF 425, and the grantee survey module of the performance data form. So we will be having a few poll questions throughout the webinar today. And for our first poll, let's stay with the 6 core elements so that you can all take a moment to pause and reflect on your program. We'll get into each in more detail soon, but at first glance, which of these would you say is the one element that your program addresses well? You may be doing all of them very well, or a few of them better than others. But for now, just pick the first one that comes to mind. Again, here on the slide are the 6 elements that we just read through. So please type the corresponding number for your response in the chat pod. Okay, it looks like we've got a 1 in there. We're documenting vendor refund procedures. Some more 1s. I see a 5. Again, no right or wrong answers here, just taking some time to reflect on your program and thinking about the one that you do well. Getting some more responses. Some more 1s, another 5. So great, thank you for your responses. It's helpful to get an initial idea for where some of our strengths are across these 6 elements. Before we go into each of the 6 core elements in detail, let's start off by briefly discussing what are vendor refunds and the relevant regulations and requirements for vendor refunds. So what are vendor refunds? Well, they are the return of unexpended LIHEAP funds, typically from a LIHEAP beneficiary's home energy benefit payment. There are many reasons a refund can occur, and here are some common examples. A vendor refund may occur because a LIHEAP beneficiary was not able to use the entire benefit that they received for the year because they moved out of the area, or they passed away and the benefit is still sitting on their account. They may have chosen another vendor and there's a balance on their account. They may have funds left over on their prepaid account that cannot be used, or there's been a reception of a duplicate payment. Depending on a grant recipient's operational setup and vendor refund process, LIHEAP refunds may be returned to the grant recipient or partnering agency that has a part in facilitating LIHEAP benefits. They might be in the form of a check or an electronic transfer. Now, what are you supposed to do with these refunds when they arrive from a vendor? That's what we are discussing today. Now that we've gotten an idea for what vendor refunds are, let's step back and look at some relevant requirements and regulations. Please note that LIHEAP grant recipients continue to be the primary interpreters of the LIHEAP statute. HHS will accept the grant recipient's interpretation of the statute as long as they are in agreement with their laws and are not considered clearly erroneous. We've listed the common requirements and regulations on the slide. While we won't go into detail on many of these today, please take a few moments to look over this list and refer to the guide for more information. If you want to better understand LIHEAP grant requirements and regulations, a good place to start is with a review of the ACF General Terms and Conditions and the LIHEAP Supplemental Terms and Conditions. Those are the terms and conditions you agreed to in order to receive your LIHEAP grant award. Now let's start our discussion on the core elements.
Thanks, Jason. I'm Blake Worthington, and let's go ahead and jump into element 1 of today's webinar. Our first core element is how to document vendor refund procedures. This is important because we've seen from our monitoring that some grant recipients did not have written, implemented vendor refund procedures. When documenting these procedures, you should take into consideration that for them to be readily implementable, they should be consistent with your relevant organizational, state, tribal, or territorial procedures and processes. It is the grant recipient's responsibility to ensure written procedures are documented and implemented for vendor refunds, regardless of whether the grant recipient or partnering agency makes the initial benefit payment or receives the refund. So now let's get into the details of documenting vendor refund procedures. Procedures explain how to carry out a process. For example, there may be a process for making updates to the carryover and reallotment report and SF-425 for refunds that have come in. That results in reports needing to be corrected and resubmitted to OCS. For these processes, written procedures help clarify the applicable and necessary who, what, when, where, and how details of performing the process. Written procedures should ensure all who work on LIHEAP have a comprehensive understanding of LIHEAP's processes and their roles and responsibilities. Today, we'll go over a few examples of information that could be included in your vendor refund procedures, but for a more comprehensive list, please refer to the guide. So for example, these procedures could specify who is responsible for the overall vendor refund process and for completing various elements within the process, what program and policy requirements are applicable to the vendor refund process, such as reporting requirements, which was mentioned earlier, and when to review and update vendor refund procedures and who is responsible for updating the procedures, where training and educational resources regarding the vendor refund process are located, and then how to review vendor refund procedures to ensure that the procedures have been met properly and implemented and are operating effectively. Now, before we move on to the next core element, I wanted to mention that the guide also includes some helpful tips for writing procedures. Our next core element is how to communicate vendor refund procedures. We look at this communication in the following ways. Communication between the grant recipient program and fiscal staff, communication to partnering agencies, and communication to vendors and other relevant entities, such as public utility commissions. As we review this together, it's key to remember that communication is an ongoing process, and can be done formally, informally, written, verbally, or in a multidimensional manner. So for example, from the top down, bottom up, laterally across the organization. If a grant recipient's method of communication is verbal, then it should be in support of, but not replace, the written documentation, such as policies and procedures. For example, a vendor meeting may be held to explain the expectations after a new vendor refund policy has been developed. Vendor refund procedures must be communicated to relevant grant recipient personnel who are responsible for performing activities funded under LIHEAP. Also, vendor refund procedures should be communicated between program and fiscal staff, especially staff that oversee LIHEAP day-to-day activities. For instance, a frontline manager or someone who does LIHEAP intake and processes applications may receive a check from a vendor, and they need to know what they're supposed to do with the check. So LIHEAP program staff should consider LIHEAP fiscal staff as key communication partners, as LIHEAP has a significant fiscal component. If program and fiscal staff continuously collaborate and understand each other's procedures and they work together to improve them, then the outcome will be a stronger program. In Appendix A of this guide, we have examples from federal monitoring of grant recipients where there was a lack of guidance to staff on vendor refund policies. Here's one of those examples, where the issue was that a grant recipient's fiscal staff could not provide a thorough explanation of the vendor refund process and explained that there are no formal policies and procedures for processing refunds. This mattered because a lack of specific guidance to staff on handling refunds puts the grant recipient at an increased risk of handling vendor refunds incorrectly and being non-compliant with the program requirements. For example, the risk of exceeding the 10% carryover cap. And the required action was to provide OCS with implemented written vendor refund policies and implemented written strategies to distribute those vendor refund policies to staff, ensuring that they are aware of the policy. Please refer to Appendix A for more examples.
Thanks, Blake. Now let's go over some common communication methods between grant recipients, program, and fiscal staff, which could help address the required action in the example Blake just went over of creating and implementing written vendor refund policy and written strategies to distribute the policy to staff. So first, there is the grant recipient's internal procedures manual. The vendor refund procedures could be in an internal procedures manual that could be separate from the LIHEAP operations manual or a part of it. Grant recipients may also have separate program and fiscal vendor refund procedures. However, if both program and fiscal staff work together to utilize processes and methods that the other side has developed, this helps both sides cultivate cooperation and an understanding of what the other side does and needs. Next, the grant recipient's LIHEAP operations manual. This is one of the most important documents that a grant recipient can utilize to communicate vendor refund procedures and requirements to its staff. Another common communication method is meetings. Please refer to the guide for suggestions on who should attend these meetings, when meetings should occur, and what should be discussed. Lastly, training and technical assistance, or TNTA. Grant recipients should provide TNTA to staff to help ensure vendor refund procedures are understood by all relevant personnel. And during these sessions, grant recipients should welcome and listen to suggestions and feedback from all staff. Grant recipients can consider maintaining training sessions on video and making those videos available to relevant personnel, for example, through an internal website. Now, Appendix B of the guide has several examples of grant recipients' vendor refund policies from their LIHEAP internal procedures manual and their LIHEAP operations manual. And in Appendix A of the guide, we also have examples from our federal monitoring of issues where there is a lack of guidance to partnering agencies by grant recipients on vendor refund policies. So let's go over one of those examples. The issue was that a grant recipient's LIHEAP operation manual provided detailed guidance regarding the handling of vendor refunds. However, it was not evident that the grant recipient was enforcing the guidelines. Especially as at a partnering agency, it was noted that the agencies were not following the guidelines or aware of the guidelines. Now, this mattered because a lack of specific guidance to partnering agencies on handling vendor refunds puts the grant recipient at an increased risk of handling vendor refunds incorrectly and being non-compliant with program requirements. Now, the required action was to provide OCS with an implemented written vendor refund policy and implemented written strategies to distribute the policy to partnering agencies, ensuring that they are aware of the policy. And you can refer to Appendix A for more examples of lack of guidance to partnering agencies on vendor refund policies. So let's go over common communication methods to partnering agencies that could help address the required action in that previous example for creating and implementing written vendor refund policy and implemented written strategies to distribute the policy to partnering agencies. So these methods could include the grant recipient's LIHEAP operations manual, partnering agency contracts or other agreements. Okay, so this may not apply to all of the LIHEAP grant recipients participating on the webinar today, but many of you have partnering agencies that help you with administering LIHEAP. And partnering agency contracts or agreements that include vendor refund requirements are strongly encouraged to help prevent misunderstandings. Sound contracts will ensure that all partnering agencies are aware of their roles and responsibilities and of all applicable federal and state, tribal, or territorial policies and procedures for vendor refunds. And annual contracts or agreements are recommended so that if requirements or situations with partnering agencies change, then grant recipients ensure the most relevant and up-to-date information is in the contracts or agreements to run an effective program. Then training and technical assistance. Grant recipients should provide TNTA to partnering agencies to help ensure vendor refund procedures and any specific risks noted for vendor refunds are discussed. Lastly, conferences. Conferences could serve as an opportunity for grant recipients to talk with their partnering agencies about vendor refund procedures and any specific trends related to vendor refunds. So at these conferences, you can talk with your partnering agencies to better understand the successes or challenges they may be having with implementing vendor refund procedures. But if partnering agencies do not attend conferences, vendor refund procedures could still be discussed with them via other methods, such as phone calls or quarterly scheduled meetings. Now on to vendors. To help ensure compliance with vendor refund procedures, grant recipients should communicate vendor refund procedures to all vendors. And the most common communication method is vendor agreements. Vendor agreements are an essential tool to help ensure enhanced program integrity. And the use of vendor agreements that specify the vendor refund procedures are strongly encouraged to help prevent misunderstandings and to ensure there is a process in place for unused benefits. Vendor agreements have various durations, for example, annual or multi-year. However, annual agreements are strongly encouraged so that if vendor refund requirements change or situations with vendors change, grant recipients ensure the most relevant and up-to-date information is in the agreements to run an effective program. Another method could be vendor notices. For instance, issuing a statement with the LIHEAP benefit to the vendor stating that by accepting payment, the vendor agrees to X, Y, and Z, which would outline the grant recipient's vendor refund procedures. Or another example is an annual vendor letter stating expectations for participating as a vendor are that X, Y, and Z will be adhered to, which again would outline the grant recipient's vendor refund procedures. Now on page 10 of the TA guide, there is a comprehensive example of a notice issued to vendors at the beginning of a program year. Then conferences can, of course, be a great method. Grant recipients that invite vendors to their conferences could ensure vendor refund procedures are on the conference agenda. And like our discussion of partnering agencies attending conferences, you can talk with vendors during conferences about any specific trends related to vendor refunds to better understand the successes or challenges they may be having with implementing vendor refund procedures. And if vendors don't attend conferences, be sure to reach out to them via other methods. Now, one common issue we have found in our federal monitoring is grant recipients do not always require that vendors provide adequate information for each refund, including identifying the year and the beneficiary's name the refund came from. The lack of specific guidance to vendors on handling refunds puts grant recipients at an increased risk of handling vendor refunds incorrectly and being non-compliant with program refunds. The required action is to provide OCS with a revised sample vendor agreement that includes detailed requirements on how to process refunds. And please see Appendix A for more examples from our federal monitoring of grant recipients regarding lack of guidance in vendor agreements.
Okay, so here is some important vendor refund process guidance to consider including in your vendor agreements. Where to return refunds, what beneficiary information to include with the refunds, such as the beneficiary name, number, or unique identifier, when the payment was made, the account number, and the refund reason. When to return refunds. For example, one grant recipient's vendor agreement stipulates that whatever money is left over on a beneficiary's account by May 31st must be refunded back to the grant recipient. The grant recipient then uses the month of June to make any new obligations in time for their state fiscal June year end. So re-obligations are made before the end of the grant recipient's current obligation period. What are the consequences if vendors do not comply with vendor refund requirements? And what specific reports or documentation vendors must submit that provides proof of amount paid or unused on a beneficiary's account? Additionally, as part of their overall monitoring program, grant recipients could consider testing that current executed vendor agreements are being kept on file and that they contain the grant recipient's most recent prescribed vendor refund procedures. Please see Appendix C for detailed examples of vendor refund requirements from grant recipients' LIHEAP vendor agreements. Now let's show how the information on the previous slide could translate into vendor agreement language by sharing this notable example from a grant recipient's LIHEAP vendor agreement. This example is also in Appendix C of the guide. The agreement outlines the vendor refund requirements as follows. Refund by check to the grant recipient any overpayments or payments that are received in error. And refunds must be completed during the federal fiscal year in which the overpayment or error occurred and provided to the grant recipient no later than 30 days after the end of that federal fiscal year. Mail refunds to, and in this case, the grant recipient. And the refund checks must be made payable to the grant recipient. The refund must include the following information: the case name, case number, date of check, reason for the refund, and the amount of the refund. There are several more notable examples in Appendix C of the vendor refund requirements and grant recipients' LIHEAP vendor agreements that you could also review. So now let's talk about how to ensure refunds are adequately tracked. our third core element. But first, we'd like to ask everyone another poll question. So for this poll, we want to know, what is your role in tracking vendor refunds? Again, there's no right or wrong answer here, and you may find that your organization does a combination of these, so feel free to select all that apply. So for this question, we ask, which best describes your role? A, I track refunds myself and or with my team. B, I supervise staff that track the refunds. C, another organizational department or unit is responsible for tracking, or D, none of the above. Okay, I see a lot of A's and C's, some more C's, lots of C's coming up. Again, no right or wrong answer here. It's always good to get a cross section of what the LIHEAP network is doing. Some more A's. So a lot of you are tracking refunds as yourself or with your team. Some more A's, another C, some more C's. Just a few more minutes to see some responses. Again, no right or wrong answer. Some more C's. So great, this was super helpful. And again, there's no right or wrong answer, and it's helpful for us to get some insight on the different roles and responsibilities we have when tracking vendor refunds.
Thank you, Jason. So to adequately track refunds to help ensure that they're properly accounted for, at a minimum, refunds should be tracked by the beneficiary's name, number, or unique identifier, the date the refund was returned, the amount of the refund, date the beneficiary benefit was issued, especially to determine the initial obligation period, the method and unique identifier of the refund, for example, check number, wire transfer number, or the ACH number, and if relevant, the name of the partnering agency who returned the refund. During federal monitoring of a grant recipient, we observed that vendor refunds were credited to the year in which they were received instead of being credited back to the year of obligation. If the grant recipient had an effective tracking system, including the date the beneficiary benefit was issued to determine the initial obligation period, then they would have been able to properly track the vendor refunds. Please see Appendix A for more examples of where grant recipients were not adequately tracking vendor refunds. As you go about tracking vendor refunds, you will want to ensure that this tracking system is as effective as possible. To support the effectiveness of the tracking system, training could be provided to staff on how to use the system, including how and where the system will be stored. For example, in a limited access shared documentation repository, and how and where notes need to be entered into the system. If a staff person could be assigned the responsibility of ensuring that the tracking system is kept up to date and operating as needed, including notifying relevant staff or partnering agencies when items are due from them. And then depending on how notes are categorized in the tracking system, data from the tracking system could also be used to support program effectiveness by identifying any needs for TNTA in order to help resolve the instance and prevent similar future instances. As a part of an overall monitoring program for grant recipients, they should consider conducting detailed reviews to ensure the prescribed refund tracking system is in place and operating effectively. Now I'd like to share a notable example from our monitoring of LIHEAP grant recipients of how one grant recipient tracks vendor refunds. This example is also in Appendix D of the guide. This is a beneficiary refund form, and it's provided in the grant recipient's fiscal guidance manual for partnering agencies, with instructions that when a partnering agency receives a refund from a vendor for a beneficiary services that were provided in a prior program year, the refund must be returned to the grant recipient within 60 days. along with this beneficiary refund form. Please note that this beneficiary refund form has at least the minimum tracking items that we mentioned earlier, and those are the beneficiary's ID and date the refund was returned, the amount of the refund, the date the beneficiary benefit was issued to determine the initial obligation period, and in this case, the grant recipient tracks by the federal award ID number. And the method and unique identifier of the refund, which this grant recipient has the check number, and the name of the partnering agency who returned the refund, which this would be provided on the top of the form. Please refer to Appendix D for another example of a grant recipient's tracking system for refunds that are received from vendors.
Okay, so now on to element 4, how to determine whether refunds are due. So we'll start this element off by sharing from Appendix A several examples from our federal monitoring where grant recipients were not reconciling prepayments in order to determine if refunds were due. Now, it's important to mention here that as the agency or tribe which has received the federal award, it is the responsibility of the non-federal entity for the oversight and monitoring of the operations of the federal award supported activities, in this case, LIHEAP, that is under guidance 45 CFR 75.352D for reference. So for our examples, at one grant recipient, the issue was that the grant recipient does not reconcile benefit prepayments against the actual energy usage of each beneficiary. At another grant recipient, the issue was that the grant recipient relies solely on vendors to provide notice if an overpayment has been made or if refunds are due back. And the final example, the issue was that the grant recipient reviews reconciliations reports received from vendors for appropriateness, including to identify overpayments and to determine if refunds are due back. However, the grant recipient did not consistently obtain monthly benefit payment reconciliations from its vendors. And please refer to Appendix A for more information on those examples. Now on the slide is the required action from the previous issues. It's a lot of information, so please take a moment to read it. Okay, so in summary, the required action was for the grant recipients to implement procedures for reconciling benefit prepayments. And over the next slide, we'll go over reconciliation methods for determining whether vendor refunds are due. Okay, so grant recipients should have reconciliation procedures in place to determine whether refunds are due. And those reconciliations should include tracking the approved benefit amount to the eventual benefit amount paid and received, identifying the refund amount, if any, and when the refund is due and subsequently collected. These reconciliations should be performed on a consistent basis, especially so that refunds are identified and recouped in a systematic and timely manner. Also, as part of an overall monitoring program, grant recipients should consider testing that benefit reconciliation procedures are operating effectively, with refunds being collected as prescribed. And here are some examples of documentation grant recipients could request from energy vendors to perform their reconciliations. Monthly vendor reconciliation reports verifying that each benefit payment received was applied to the appropriate amount and how much. Beneficiary bills or invoices, and statements of beneficiaries' energy usage. And we touched on this previously during our vendor agreements discussion, but it's important to note again that reconciliation documentation required from energy vendors and their due dates could be detailed in vendor agreements.
Thanks, Dee Dee. So now on to the fifth core element, how to determine when refunds can be reissued as benefits and when they must be returned to the federal government. The determination starts based on the obligation period the refunds relate to. So refunds must be credited back to the federal fiscal year the obligation was originally made. Refunds that are returned from the vendor to the non-federal entity are considered deobligated. They can be reobligated if the refunds received do not exceed the 10% carryover cap and the LIHEAP grant obligation period has not expired. We will go over this point in the next slide as well. LIHEAP funds always retain the characteristics of being federal funds. So grant recipients must ensure that unused benefits are credited to the grant recipient's LIHEAP instead of being repurposed as general funds. And any federal funds from this award not liquidated by the date required under the grant recipient's own fiscal control procedures. So here is an if-then chart for grant recipients to consider when determining whether refunds can be reissued as benefits or when they should be returned to HHS. So if the original obligation was in the current federal fiscal year, then the funds can be reobligated for LIHEAP purposes. If the maximum amount was not carried over from the prior federal fiscal year, then refunds from the prior federal fiscal year can be reobligated for use in the current federal fiscal year. And if the maximum amount was carried over from the prior federal fiscal year, then refunds must be returned to HHS. And if the refunds were from obligation periods that had expired, then refunds must be returned to HHS.
Thanks, Jason. So now we'll go on to the final element, how to determine when refunds require updates to be made to the carryover and reallotment report, which is commonly referred to as the carryover report, the Federal Financial Report Standard Form, SF-425, or simply just the SF-425, and the Grantee Survey module of the Performance Data Form, which is simply referred to as the Grantee Survey. Please note that the Grantee Survey only applies to state grant recipients and DC. Tribes and territories are not required to submit the Performance Data Form. We'll start with Appendix A of the guide with an example from the federal monitoring of grant recipients where reporting requirements were not met as a result of vendor refunds. The issue was that the grant recipient had not updated the carryover reports when the reported amounts had changed as a result of receiving refunds. Now, it mattered because if the refunds are not properly consolidated and accounted for, then there is an increased risk of the grant recipient inadequately reporting the impacts of refunds in the carryover report, SF-425, and the grantee survey. And the required action was to provide OCS with an implemented written vendor refund policy that specifically states when refunds require updates to be made to the carryover report, SF-425, and grantee survey, and who is responsible for making those updates. You'll find Appendix E, it'll have more examples from the grant recipient's LIHEAP's internal procedures manuals of procedures for updating the LIHEAP carryover and reallotment report, SF-425, and grantee survey for vendor refunds. Now, in addition to the carryover report, there are two other reports that could be impacted from vendor refunds, the SF-425 and the grantee survey. But we'll start by discussing the potential impact of refunds on the carryover report and how to handle it, and then go over the SF-425 and grantee survey reporting for refunds. If you receive refunds in the current obligation period and are not able to reobligate the funds based on your state's tribal or territorial definition of obligation, then these funds could be considered unobligated. And you'll need to update and submit the carryover and reallotment report for these funds. Now we have a few tips for determining the amount to carry over to avoid exceeding the 10% carryover cap. So tip number 1 is carrying over less than 10%. Consider carrying over less than 10% to allow for a cushion and flexibility in case refunds are received of unexpired funds from prior obligation period. And tip number 2 is analyzing the average annual refund amount. Now, consider annualizing the average annual refund amount based on recent trends to better forecast how refunds could impact the carryover amount. For example, if you analyze refunds received in the last 3 program years and determine that approximately $5,000 in refunds was received in each of those years, then you could assess whether this trend is expected to continue in the coming year and incorporate it into your carryover calculations.
Okay, so now let's discuss reporting for refunds on the SF-425. The carryover amount reported on the carryover report should correspond to the unobligated balance on the SF-425. So if the carryover amount reported on your carryover report is updated for refunds, then the unobligated balance in the SF-425 will also need to be updated with the adjusted amount. In summary, you will need to submit a revised SF-425 with an unobligated balance that corresponds to the carryover amount reported in the revised carryover report. And then the final report that we're going to go over is the grantee survey. So similar to the SF-425, if the carryover amount reported on your carryover report is updated for refunds, then the unobligated funds carried over to the next federal fiscal year balance in the grantee survey needs to be updated with the adjusted amount. So you'll need to revise the grantee survey to agree to the changes in the carryover report and then submit the revised grantee survey. And for more information on how to properly report unobligated balances to HHS, please see the LIHEAP Carryover and SF-425 Reporting TA Guide, which includes information on reporting unobligated balances on the carryover report, SF-425, and the grantee survey.
All right, now that we've discussed all 6 core elements in detail, let's take another poll. And for this poll, let's regroup and take some time to reflect on each. At the start of the webinar, we asked you to think about which of these your program is doing well. And now we want to ask you to think about, one element that you would like to study further, either in the TA guide or from your own review of resources. Again, you may already be addressing this element, but we would like you to still examine it and see what you would like to learn more about. Please go ahead and type the corresponding number of your response in the chat pod. Seeing a lot of 6s to determining when refunds require updates to be made to those reports. Some 2s, 5s. Great. Yeah, a lot of 5s and 6s. And thank you for all of your responses. And the element that you selected to examine further, please go ahead and do that review when you can. We found that often we have so much that we're curious about and want to learn more about, but taking it one area at a time should be able to help prioritize learning and do it at a pace that works well for you.
Thanks, Blake. Let's all do a quick wrap up now. As you can see, our vision for the TA Guide is to provide you with targeted technical assistance in a format that's easy to read and easy to implement. And as you all read the guide and share it with your teams for further review and discussion, think about your LIHEAP strengths and weaknesses, identify any areas where improvements could be made, and then make those enhancements to your program. The self-assessment checklist should help you with documenting this information in one place. And please provide feedback to OCS if additional clarification would be helpful, or if you have ideas for additional items to include in the next version of the TA guide for vendor refunds. It would especially be helpful for us if you could provide feedback on where you think you've got strong procedures, tools, and templates that you could share with us so that we can learn from them and share them with other grant recipients. Here are some of the resources that we found were very helpful to develop content for the guide. After you've reviewed the guide, you could review these resources as well if you'd like to study them further. And these resources are also in the resources section of the guide. And the resources we discussed were all found on the LIHEAP Virtual Library, OCS website, the LIHEAP website navigator, and the LIHEAP Clearinghouse. They're all great places to look for a variety of TA content, and you can do keyword searches to help look for anything specific. And I want to let you know that OCS is planning on sending you a survey soon to evaluate the training that we provided today. Please complete the survey so that we can get your feedback and keep trying to support you and your teams as best as we can with technical assistance for LIHEAP. Thank you all for your time, and now turning it over to Kate.
Thank you, Chet, and thank you, Dee Dee and Jason and Blake and John. To recap, some important points to remember are that you have this great technical assistance information now to provide you with guidance on vendor refunds. And within the next week or so, you'll get the TA or the technical assistance guide to review. Use the self-assessment checklist. I will say it again. Use the self-assessment checklist. It was posted in the chat today. It will be really helpful to use that to look at after our webinar today and see where you can improve. Look at your vendor agreements or your notices to vendors or your letters to vendors, even if it's just an agenda for your vendor meetings. Look at those and see if they need to be revised to include the information that you need to process vendor refunds appropriately. Remember to leave a cushion in your budgeted carryover amount in case you do get refunds from vendors. And in addition, when you get a vendor refund, look back at the cheat sheet or the chart of when you have to return those funds. Lastly, if you have any questions as you get vendor refunds or as you're refining your policies or procedures, please feel free to reach out to us at OCS, reach out to your assigned federal LIHEAP program specialist or our auditor, John Thompson, and we'd be happy to help you. And over to you, John.
Thanks, Kate. So just a reference as point of contacts. You just heard Kate speak now. She's our lead program specialist within the Division of Energy Assistance. And I'm John Thompson, to reiterate, the auditor here. And if you need to contact one of us regards to this webinar, there's our information right there. And also you have the link there for the other LIHEAP program specialists available in the Division of Energy Assistance, which is also available on our Office of Community Services webpage, which I hope everyone now has access to or knows where to find that at. If not, please mention that in the chat and we'll post that if anyone does not know how to access the Office of Community Services website, where you'll find all of our information. Okay, everyone, so we have, well, we're about at 3 o'clock now. It's a very informative webinar, so I mean, we want to respect everyone's time. We do have, there are some questions that are in the chat. I'll try to address one or two of them if everyone has moments for that, but we'll try to keep that very limited. We have 3 questions here. So, and one of them, I think 4 questions, and actually two of them have to do with, can we get copies of the guide in the slide deck? As Kate mentioned, we will be sending out a copy of the guide. And the slide deck, we will work on that. I will encourage everyone, we're going to post that on our YouTube page as well, this webinar presentation, so you'll be able to see this entire presentation and the slide deck on our webpage. And we'll make that available and let all the attendees know about that. So we have 2 questions here, and and since we're at the limit here, we're going to record those questions for Leslie of Illinois, I believe, and Michael Schmitz of Minnesota, I believe. So we're going to get your questions here, and we're going to address those to you after the webinar, since we're at our time limit. But we really appreciate everyone. And I see a question here from Tatia. I hope I got that right. Tatia Phillips Dorset, that she asked a question as well. You might have posted that in the chat box, so I will go and look in the chat box as well to look for your question also. Tatia? Oh, Tashay, thank you. Got it. Thank you so much. So Tashay, I will go ahead and look for your question as well. So we'll address all your questions individually at the conclusion of this webinar. So once again, thank you everyone for joining the webinar and for your time, your attentiveness, and let's look out for our next webinar that we have coming in the future. Thank you so much.